Good evening. Tonight we're diving into something that may feel uncomfortably close to home, an exploration of what it truly means to choose yourself in a world that constantly demands you be someone else. You probably wouldn't survive this if you've spent your whole life pleasing others without ever listening to your own voice. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your current location and the time it is where you are. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Part 1, the question that changes everything. It started, as most turning points do, in the quiet. No big crisis, no earth-shattering revelation, just a Tuesday morning, gray and unremarkable, where I caught my own reflection in the bathroom mirror and wondered, am I actually living this life for me? Or am I just keeping up with the story other people expect me to tell? It wasn't a question I had planned to ask. It simply arrived, sharp and unwelcome, like a pebble in my shoe I couldn't quite ignore. For years, I'd been moving through the world with a kind of practiced efficiency. I ticked boxes. I met deadlines. I said yes when yes was expected and no only when it was safe. I was dependable, agreeable, almost forgettable in my predictability. On paper, it was fine. Safe job, stable relationships, a calendar so full it proved I was living life to the fullest. But somewhere deep in the marrow of my bones, I knew I was coasting. There's a peculiar ache that comes from fulfilling every expectation but your own. It doesn't shout, it hums, a low, constant vibration of dissatisfaction that you can't quite name until one day you do. That day for me was that gray Tuesday. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." At the time, I didn't feel privileged. I felt stuck. I wasn't even sure who that true self was anymore. Somewhere between other people's needs and my own fear of disappointing them, I'd lost track. And the strangest part, I wasn't unhappy enough to change. That's the trap no one warns you about. Comfort can be more dangerous than pain. Pain demands action. Comfort lets you rot slowly, with a polite smile on your face. Still, something about that morning hit differently. Maybe it was the way the early light caught the edges of my tired eyes. Maybe it was the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Maybe it was just time. Quirky fact break. Did you know hermit crabs will abandon their shell if it becomes too small, even though the search for a new one leaves them totally exposed? That risk of being unprotected while in transition is the same risk we face when we leave behind a life that no longer fits. I didn't know it then, but that's exactly what I was about to do. In psychology, there's something called self-discrepancy theory, the idea that the bigger the gap between who you are and who you think you should be, the greater your discomfort. I realized that morning that my own gap had become a chasm. I'd been the good version of myself for so long. I'd stopped asking if good meant true. And here's the thing. Truth is inconvenient. It interrupts routines. It rearranges relationships. It demands you look at what you've built and admit when it's not enough. I wasn't ready for all of that yet, but I was ready to start asking questions. That was my first act of rebellion, not quitting my job, not cutting people out, not booking a one-way ticket to Bali. Just curiosity. What do I actually want? What would my life look like if I stopped performing? Who am I when no one's clapping? The questions scared me. But they also lit a tiny flame inside, one I hadn't felt in years. That day, I didn't make any sweeping changes. I went to work. I answered emails. I picked up groceries. But there was a subtle shift, like I'd been standing in a room with the lights off, and someone had finally cracked the door open. From that sliver of light, I began to see the outlines of another life, one where my choices weren't reflexes, where my yes actually meant yes, where I wasn't constantly calculating how my actions would land with everyone else before asking how they sat with me. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And I think that's how real change starts, not with a bang, but with a whisper that says, "What if this isn't all there is?" That whisper became my constant companion in the weeks that followed. It would show up in the pause before I agreed to a favor I didn't want to do, in the twinge of longing when I saw someone else living unapologetically, in the quiet sigh I let out at night when the house was still and I finally allowed myself to feel how tired I was. I didn't have the answers yet, but I had the question. And sometimes The right question is more dangerous and more liberating than any answer you've been given. That morning, I stepped away from the mirror, coffee in hand, and carried that question with me into the day. I didn't know it then, but I had just taken my first step out of the shell. Part 2, The World's Invisible Script. You don't notice the script at first. It's not handed to you like a formal contract. There's no table of contents, no bold title that says the life you're expected to live. It's quieter than that. It's the bedtime stories with neat morals, the relatives who ask about your grades before they ask about your happiness, the congratulatory smiles when you land the right job, the awkward silences when you hint that you might want something different. Little by little, without even meaning to, you memorize your lines. By the time I was an adult, I could recite mine by heart. Get the degree, get the job, keep the job, build a life that looks respectable from the outside. It's not that anyone ever forced me. In fact, most of the time, the world congratulated me for following the script so well. I got gold stars for compliance. My parents didn't have to worry. My friends thought I had it all figured out. But deep inside, I was starting to suspect that the script wasn't mine. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." I used to think that was about self-esteem, but I realize now it's terrifying because accepting yourself often means rejecting the version of you that the world prefers. And the world doesn't like losing control over its characters. Quirky fact break. There's a species of ant that can fake its death for hours to avoid danger. But here's the catch. Sometimes they keep up the act so long that they miss opportunities to feed or mate. Self-protection can become self-sabotage when you never break the pose. I was doing my own version of that. In sociology, there's the idea of social scripts, unwritten rules for how to behave in certain contexts. They keep society predictable, but when those scripts don't fit you, following them feels like wearing someone else's clothes, stiff in the shoulders, itchy at the seams. I'd been wearing that ill-fitting outfit for years. Every time I laughed at a joke I didn't find funny. Every time I said I'm fine when I wasn't. Every time I prioritized being liked over being understood. The problem is, the longer you follow the invisible script, the more it becomes muscle memory. Deviating feels awkward, even wrong. I still remember the first time I improvised, said something real in a conversation where I was expected to be polite and agreeable. It was a small moment. Someone made a casual comment about how lucky I was to have such a stable, traditional path. The old me would have smiled and nodded. But this time, I heard myself say, sometimes stability feels like a cage. Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where you can almost hear the social fabric tearing. They changed the subject quickly. But I felt it, a ripple in my reality. One line, spoken honestly, and I'd already gone off script. It felt dangerous. It felt thrilling. It felt alive. In that moment, I understood something important. The invisible script doesn't vanish all at once. You don't burn it in a dramatic bonfire. You rewrite it, one line at a time. That means tolerating some discomfort. It means people will notice. It means you'll be misunderstood. But the reward is that slowly, imperceptibly, your life starts to sound more like you. And once you hear that voice, your real one, it's almost impossible to go back to lip-syncing someone else's lines. Still, I wasn't naive. The world doesn't give up its scripts without resistance. I knew if I kept improvising, things would change. Relationships might shift. Opportunities might close. Safety nets might disappear. But something inside me whispered, yes, let them, because I'd rather risk silence than keep speaking in a voice that isn't mine. Part 3, Hearing the Whisper Within. It didn't arrive like thunder. It wasn't a booming voice or a sudden download of divine wisdom. It was softer than that, so soft that, for years, I mistook it for background noise. The whisper, it came in the quiet moments. Usually when I was too tired to maintain my performance, walking home alone after dinner with friends, staring out the window while waiting for the kettle to boil, lying in bed in the thin space between wakefulness and sleep. This isn't it. That was all it ever said at first. Just those 3 words. I'd push it away. Of course, remind myself how good I had it. Remind myself of all the reasons I should be grateful. And I was grateful, at least. I told myself so often enough that I almost believed it. But gratitude can be a tricky mask. Sometimes it's genuine thankfulness. Sometimes it's just fear of wanting more. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That whisper was my unconscious trying to slip through the cracks. Quirky fact break. Did you know that certain plants, like sunflowers, can hear the sound of bees and start producing sweeter nectar almost instantly? Nature has a way of listening for what nourishes it, and so do we, if we let ourselves. The trouble is, I didn't trust myself to listen. I was worried that if I truly paid attention, the whisper would grow into a demand, and I'd have no choice but to act on it. So I drowned it out. I overcommitted. I kept my headphones in. I filled every blank space in my calendar. I even made self-care another task to manage, just to avoid stillness. But the thing about whispers is, they don't compete for volume. They wait, patiently. And one night, they caught me off guard. It was late, past midnight. I was sitting on the kitchen floor with a cup of tea, not because I was sad, but because I couldn't sleep. The day had been fine, in that bland way that doesn't inspire either joy or despair. And suddenly, there it was again. This isn't it. But this time, there was something else. A feeling, not just dissatisfaction, but longing. It wasn't just telling me what wasn't right. It was hinting at something that could be. A life that felt lighter. Mornings that felt like beginnings, not obligations. Connections that didn't require me to shrink or contort. It didn't paint me the whole picture, just gave me the outline, enough to make me curious. In psychology, they call this intrinsic motivation, the pull toward something simply because it feels aligned, not because it's rewarded or approved by others. It's the opposite of the invisible script. And that night, sitting barefoot on the kitchen tiles, I realized the whisper wasn't trying to ruin my life. It was trying to return me to it. That was the beginning of my listening practice. No, I didn't quit my job the next day. I didn't book a retreat in Bali or announce to the world that I was finding myself. I just started giving the whisper space. 10 minutes in the morning without checking my phone. A short walk without a podcast. Saying I'll think about it instead of yes on autopilot. Little by little, the whisper became clearer. And the more I listened, the more I realized it had been there all along since childhood. In fact, I'd just gotten very good at ignoring it in favor of louder voices. Parents, teachers, partners, bosses. But here's the thing, once you start listening, you can't unhear it. And that's when life begins to shift. Not in the big, cinematic ways you might expect, at least not yet, but in the subtle rearrangements of your inner landscape. The coffee tastes different. The air feels lighter. The smile you wear isn't just for show anymore. And even if nothing external changes, you do, because the truth, once heard, keeps speaking, and sooner or later, it asks for more than just your attention. It asks for your courage. Part 4, The Shadow in the Mirror. The first time I truly saw my shadow, I almost looked away. It wasn't flattering. It wasn't noble. It wasn't the kind of self-image you'd post about online with a poetic caption. It was raw, unfiltered, and uncomfortably honest. Carl Jung called the shadow the parts of ourselves we reject, deny, or hide, sometimes even from ourselves. The jealousy we disguise as criticism, the fear we mask with arrogance, the anger we bury so deep it seeps out sideways. For most of my life, I thought the shadow was bad news, something to conquer, fix, or at least keep locked away where no one could see it. But here's the paradox. What you hide doesn't disappear. It grows, quietly, in the dark. Quirky fact break. In caves untouched by light. Some species of fish evolved to lose their eyesight completely, relying instead on heightened senses of touch and vibration. Deny one sense, and others take over. Suppress one truth, and others will emerge to compensate, often in ways you don't expect. My shadow had been compensating for years. It showed up in subtle sarcasm when I felt overlooked, in overachievement when I feared being unworthy, in people-pleasing that looked like kindness but was actually a desperate plea for acceptance. One evening, it finally caught up with me. I was journaling, something I'd started doing after I began listening to that whisper. At first, my writing was polite, tidy, almost performative, as if I expected someone to read it and be impressed by my self-awareness. But that night, something in me snapped. I wrote without censoring. I let the words tumble out, messy, petty, ungrateful, contradictory. I admitted things I didn't even want to admit to myself. I was angry. I was jealous. I was tired of pretending I didn't care when I did. And when I put the pen down, I felt lighter. For the first time, I'd met my shadow without shaming it. I hadn't tried to dress it up. I hadn't tried to bury it. I just looked at it and said, I see you. In Jungian psychology, this is called shadow integration, acknowledging these hidden parts not to glorify them, but to reclaim the energy we've been using to keep them out of sight. The strangest part, the more I acknowledged my shadow, the less control it had over me. That jealousy lost its edge. That anger softened into assertiveness. That fear of being unworthy began to dissolve into quiet self-respect. It's not that the shadow disappeared, it's still here, and always will be. But now it's like an old acquaintance I nod to in the street, not a monster hiding in my basement. There's a freedom in that, because when you stop pretending to be flawless, you stop exhausting yourself trying to maintain the illusion. And when you stop exhausting yourself, you have more energy to live the life you actually want. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something else. When I was honest with myself about my flaws, I became more compassionate toward others. It was as if giving myself permission to be human made me less judgmental about everyone else's humanity. 2, and maybe that's the real gift of shadow work. It doesn't just reconnect you to yourself. It reconnects you to the messy, beautiful truth of being alive. Looking back, I think this was the moment my journey shifted from curiosity to commitment. The whisper had cracked the door open. The shadow showed me what I'd been keeping behind it, and I realized if I could face the parts of myself I feared most, maybe I could face whatever came next. Part 5, Redefining Self-Love. For a long time, I thought self-love meant bubble baths and scented candles. And to be fair, sometimes it does. There's nothing wrong with a little comfort. But somewhere along the way, I confused self-love with self-indulgence, and more importantly, I assumed it was supposed to feel good all the time. What I've learned is that real self-love is often uncomfortable. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." I used to think acceptance meant staying exactly as I was, flaws and all, forever. Now I see it differently. Acceptance is the starting point, not the end. You can't grow from a place you refuse to acknowledge. Quirky fact break. Did you know that when a lobster grows, it has to shed its shell entirely, leaving itself completely exposed until a new one hardens? It's a vulnerable, dangerous time, but without it, the lobster would never grow. That's what self-love felt like for me, shedding an old shell and standing bare, without the armor of other people's approval. I started small, saying no to things I didn't want to do, even if it disappointed people. Eating when I was hungry, not when the clock told me to. Going to bed earlier, not because I was disciplined, but because my body was begging me for rest. At first, it felt selfish. I'd spent so many years measuring my worth by how useful I was to others that doing something purely for myself triggered guilt, like an alarm bell. But over time, I noticed a shift. The more I honored my own needs, the more present I was for the people I cared about. I wasn't giving from an empty cup anymore. And perhaps most surprisingly, I began to attract people who respected my boundaries instead of testing them. Self-love isn't just about how you treat yourself, it sets the tone for how the world treats you. 2, in the past, I would have tolerated relationships that drained me because I didn't think I deserved better. Now, those same dynamics made me restless, even uncomfortable. They no longer fit. The way an old coat no longer fits once you've outgrown it. That's when I understood something crucial. Self-love isn't about convincing yourself you're perfect. It's about refusing to abandon yourself. Even when you see your imperfections clearly, it's looking at the tired, unmotivated, insecure parts of you and saying, "You still belong here." That kind of love isn't glamorous. It's not a social media ready montage of spa days and green smoothies. It's a daily, often invisible practice. It's getting up when you don't feel like it. It's speaking gently to yourself when you make a mistake. It's letting go of what you've outgrown, even when it breaks your heart. And sometimes, it's doing the hard, boring, unromantic work, therapy sessions that leave you emotionally drained, budgeting to protect your future self, having uncomfortable conversations instead of letting resentment fester. This wasn't the self-love I'd been sold, but it was the kind I needed. Because the truth is, comfort without honesty isn't self-love, it's self-avoidance. And I was finally ready to stop avoiding myself. Part 6, The Art of Saying No Without Guilt. The first time I said no and meant it, my voice shook. Not because the word itself was difficult, it's short, sharp. simple, but because of everything it implied. I was choosing myself over someone else's expectations. For most of my life, I was fluent in yes, yes. I can help you with that even though I'm exhausted. Yes, I can take on that extra work even though my plate is already full. Yes, I can attend that event even though I'd rather be home in pajamas. I told myself it was kindness, generosity, team spirit. But deep down, it was fear of disappointing people, fear of being seen as selfish, fear of not being liked. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." What he didn't add, but what I've learned, is that becoming who you truly are often requires disappointing people who prefer the old version of you. Quirky fact break. In Japanese martial arts, there's a principle called mai, the proper distance between you and your opponent. Too close, and you're in danger. Too far, and you lose connection. Boundaries work the same way. They're about the right distance, not complete disconnection. My early attempts at saying no were clumsy. Sometimes I over-explained, piling on excuses until my no sounded like an apology. Other times, I was abrupt, my voice sharper than intended, because I was bracing for backlash. But I learned that a clear no, I can't do that often, lands better than a long-winded justification. I learned that people who truly respect you don't need an essay to accept your boundaries. I learned that the discomfort of saying no lasts minutes, but the resentment of saying yes can last for weeks or years. At first, saying no felt like burning bridges. I worried I'd lose relationships, opportunities, trust. And in some cases, I did. But here's the thing. Those were the connections that depended on my compliance, not my presence. And losing them made space for the kind of connections I actually wanted. Boundaries didn't just protect my time and energy, they clarified my values. They made me realize how much of my life I'd been spending on obligations that didn't align with what truly mattered to me. There's a strange side effect to this. Once you start saying no, your yes becomes more valuable. When I agreed to something, it was because I genuinely wanted to be there, not because I felt trapped into it. And people noticed. My yes carried weight now. One of the biggest surprises, I started respecting myself more. Not in an inflated, arrogant way, but in a quiet, grounded way. I could trust myself to protect my own time, my own needs, my own well-being. That self-trust was new and intoxicating. These days, I think of no as an act of generosity, not towards the other person, but towards myself. And when I protect my energy, I'm a better friend, partner, and colleague to the people who matter most. The guilt still whispers sometimes. But now, I have an answer. I'm not saying no to you, I'm saying yes to me. Part 7, Losing to Gain. No one talks enough about how growth often feels like grief. When you start changing, really changing, you don't just gain new things. You lose people, habits, places, even versions of yourself you thought would be around forever. And loss, even when it's necessary, still hurts. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." I used to think that meant you had to suffer in some grand, dramatic way to evolve. But I've learned it's quieter than that. More like a series of small funerals for the life you've outgrown. Quirky fact break. Did you know some snakes will refuse food entirely when it's time to shed their skin? It's as if their bodies know they can't digest the old and grow the new at the same time. That's exactly how it felt when I began letting go. First came the habits, the endless scrolling late at night, the just one more episode that bled into 2 a.m., the way I'd say yes to every social invite, not because I wanted to go, but because I didn't want to be forgotten. Then came the people. Some drifted naturally, like leaves carried off by the wind. We stopped calling, stopped making plans, stopped trying. Others ended abruptly, an argument, a boundary they didn't like, an incompatibility we could no longer ignore. Each departure stung, but every goodbye created space I didn't know I needed. I'd always thought of loss as a subtraction. Now, I began to see it as preparation. You clear a garden before you plant something new. You empty a glass before you pour in fresh water. It wasn't just about people or habits, it was about identity. I had to release the version of myself who was always agreeable, always available, always the safe choice. She'd served me once, but she couldn't take me where I was going. And here's the strange part, sometimes I missed her. She was comfortable, predictable. She kept me liked, if not loved, but she also kept me small. In psychology, they talk about identity foreclosure, committing to a self image too early and refusing to explore other possibilities. I'd been living in foreclosure for years, and now I was finally evicting myself. It wasn't glamorous. Some nights, I lay awake wondering if I'd made a mistake. Some mornings, I felt the emptiness so sharply it was like stepping into a cold room. But alongside the grief, something else was blooming. Relief? I didn't have to keep up the old performance anymore. I didn't have to contort myself into shapes that fit other people's needs. I didn't have to pretend I enjoyed things that drained me. Letting go hurt, but staying would have hurt more. And slowly, the space left behind began to fill, not with replacements, but with possibilities. Conversations that nourished me, activities that felt like play, not obligation. A growing sense of peace that came from knowing I could survive the loss of anything that wasn't meant for me. It turns out that in order to gain the life you want, you have to make room for it first. And that almost always means saying goodbye to something you thought you couldn't live without. Part 8: The Quiet Power of Solitude. I used to think being alone was the same as being lonely. If I had a free evening, I'd fill it. Dinner with friends, a phone call with family, an endless scroll through strangers' lives online. Silence felt heavy. Emptiness felt dangerous. But when I started saying no more often, when I began letting go of people and habits that didn't fit anymore, I suddenly found myself with something I hadn't had in years: time. At first, it was uncomfortable. Carl Jung once said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." That resonated deeply. I realized that much of my loneliness in the past had come from being surrounded by people who didn't truly see me. Quirky fact break. There's a species of tree in South Africa, the baobab, that can store thousands of liters of water in its trunk to survive long dry seasons. From the outside, it looks still and lifeless during drought, but inside, it's holding everything it needs. That's what solitude began to feel like for me. Storage. Quietly gathering energy, clarity, and self-trust. In the beginning, I fought the stillness. I'd put on music, clean obsessively, scroll aimlessly, anything to avoid just sitting with myself. But eventually, something shifted. One Sunday afternoon, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and no phone, no book, no plan. At first, my mind did what it always does, ran through to-do lists, replayed old conversations, imagined future scenarios, and then it slowed. The breeze brushed my skin, the sunlight shifted across the floor. I heard the faint hum of the city, the sound of my own breathing. It was so ordinary and so profound. That was the first time I realized solitude isn't the absence of something, it's the presence of yourself. In solitude, I began to hear the nuances of my own thoughts without interference. I could tell which ideas were truly mine and which were echoes of other people's voices. I started to crave it, not as an escape, but as a return. This didn't mean I stopped valuing connection. In fact, my relationships improved. Time alone gave me the space to process, to recharge, to show up more authentically with the people I cared about. Solitude also became a teacher. It taught me patience, how to be with an unanswered question without forcing a solution. It taught me self-reliance, how to soothe myself without reaching for distractions. It taught me that my own company could be not just tolerable, but nourishing. Over time, my fear of being alone dissolved, and in its place grew a quiet confidence. I am enough, even when no one else is here to confirm it. That, I think, is one of the most powerful shifts in a person's life. Because when you're no longer afraid of your own company, you stop settling for relationships or situations that keep you busy but empty. You'd rather have space than noise, depth than performance, truth than constant company. Solitude stopped feeling like a gap to fill and started feeling like a foundation to build on. And from that foundation, I knew I could create a life that wasn't just full, but whole. Part 9: The Compass of Inner Values. The more time I spent in solitude, the clearer it became. I'd been navigating my life using everyone else's compass but my own. Family told me which direction meant success. Friends told me which direction meant fun. Society told me which direction meant acceptable. And I, eager to please, followed them all, never noticing how far I'd drifted from my own true north. Carl Jung once wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. I'd been wearing other people's shoes for years. No wonder I was blistered and limping. Quirky fact break. Homing pigeons can find their way home from hundreds of miles away by sensing the Earth's magnetic fields. Even when disoriented, they eventually realign with their internal navigation system. Humans have that too. It's called values. The problem was, I'd never really defined mine. I'd inherited them, absorbed them like background music. So I started asking myself questions. What actually matters to me? Not what should matter. Not what matters to the people I admire. Not what looks good on paper. But what makes me feel alive. I wrote it down, raw and unpolished. Truth, creativity, freedom, connection, presence. The more I sat with these words, the more they began to function like coordinates. If an opportunity, relationship, or habit didn't align with them, it was a sign I was headed off course. At first, living by my own values felt selfish. Wouldn't that make me less reliable, less generous, less good? But the opposite happened. When I acted in alignment with my values, I was more present, more generous, more consistent, not because I was forcing it, but because I was living from a place that was real. It also made decision-making simpler. Before, I'd agonize over choices. Should I take this job? Go to this event? Say yes to this project? Now, I'd just ask, does it align with my values? If not, the answer was no. Not a guilty no. Not a defensive no. Just a clear one. Living this way began to change how I saw others. 2, I stopped expecting people to share my exact values, and I stopped resenting them when they didn't. It was freeing. Like taking off a pair of glasses I didn't realize were tinted, but perhaps the biggest shift was internal. I started trusting myself, not blindly, but deeply. Even when I couldn't predict the outcome of a choice, I knew it was mine. I wasn't outsourcing my life to the loudest voice in the room anymore. In many ways, finding my values felt like rediscovering a language I'd forgotten I could speak. And once you speak it fluently, you can't go back to pretending you don't understand it. Your compass keeps pointing you home. Part 10, Breaking the Chains of Familiarity. I used to think that comfort was the reward for surviving life's storms. You hustle, you sacrifice, you endure. Then you get to relax in a place where nothing surprises you. It sounded nice, until I realized that my comfort was actually a cage with good interior design. I knew every corner of it, every sound it made at night, the leaky tap in the kitchen, the predictable arguments, the way Mondays felt heavier than they should. Safe, yes. Life-giving, not at all. Carl Jung once warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. That's what I was doing, clinging to routines that numbed me because they kept me from confronting what I'd outgrown. Here's a quirky fact for you. Hermit crabs must leave their shells to grow, and during that transition, they're completely vulnerable, soft-bodied, exposed, and at risk, but without that terrifying exposure, they literally cannot survive. Humans aren't so different. Our shells are the familiar jobs, relationships, and habits we hide inside, and stepping out of them feels like walking into a storm without an umbrella. I remember the exact night I realized I was too comfortable for my own good. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, streaming the same TV series for the 3rd time, telling myself I was just relaxing. But in that quiet, I heard it, my inner voice, faint but firm. Is this really it? That question haunted me for weeks. Every time I tried to dismiss it, it came back louder. Leaving familiarity isn't glamorous. It's messy. People ask questions you can't answer. They offer advice you didn't ask for. They tell you you're being reckless. Sometimes you start to believe them. But the truth, the fear you feel when stepping into the unknown, is proof you're alive. The discomfort is a signal that you're stretching into new territory. Old age wisdom tells us that the path of least resistance often leads to the place we least want to be. And I was done traveling that road. So I began letting go, first in small ways. I tried a new route to work. I spoke up in conversations where I'd usually stay quiet. I read books outside my usual genre. And then the bigger shifts came. I left a project I'd been part of for years. I distanced myself from people who only knew and liked the outdated version of me. Each time, I felt that familiar panic. What if I regret this? But on the other side of each choice was space to breathe, to move, to grow. I won't lie. There were moments I wanted to crawl back into my old shell. But every time I almost did, I'd remember how cramped it felt in there. and I'd keep walking forward. Eventually, I learned something freeing. You can survive without the safety of familiarity, and in that survival, you discover a strength that makes you unstoppable. The cage door had been open all along. I just needed the courage to step through it. Part 11, Dancing with Uncertainty. If comfort was my cage, then uncertainty was the open field beyond it, wide, unpredictable, and full of shadows I couldn't name. For most of my life, I treated uncertainty like a threat. I wanted maps, guarantees, step-by-step instructions. If the path wasn't clearly marked, I hesitated. If the ending wasn't certain, I stalled. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown." I didn't understand that until I found myself in the middle of a season where there was no solution, only forward motion. Quirky fact break. Did you know that in some forests, certain seeds only sprout after a fire? The heat cracks their shells, making growth possible in conditions that would have seemed destructive. That's how uncertainty began to feel for me. Less like destruction, more like transformation. When I stepped out of the familiar, my first instinct was to replace it with a new plan immediately. My brain hated the void. It wanted something, anything to cling to. But each time I tried to rush into a decision just to avoid the discomfort, I could feel the whisper in me saying, "Wait, let the ground settle." At first, waiting felt unbearable. I'd measure my days by how close I was to a clear answer. I kept looking for signs, anything to point me towards certainty. But slowly, I noticed something. The more I let myself be in the not knowing, the more open I became to possibilities I wouldn't have seen otherwise. Opportunities started to appear, conversations, projects, even unexpected friendships. That didn't fit my old plans, but felt alive in a way my careful blueprints never had. It was like learning to dance without choreography. At first, every step felt awkward. I stumbled. I second-guessed. But gradually, my body learned to respond to the music in real time. I realized uncertainty wasn't a blank void. It was a canvas. The lines weren't drawn yet, which meant I could draw them myself. And the more I allowed myself to move in this way, the less I feared getting it wrong. There is no wrong when you're creating from the inside out. There's only movement. And the meaning you choose to give it. Of course, the fear didn't vanish. It still shows up, whispering worst-case scenarios late at night. But now, I know that fear is just part of the dance. It doesn't have to lead. Uncertainty, I've learned, isn't something you conquer. It's something you befriend. You stop asking it for promises and start trusting it for possibilities. And in that trust, something unexpected happens. Life stops feeling like a test you might fail and starts feeling like an adventure you get to shape. Part 12, The Art of Saying No. There was a time when the word no felt like a door slamming. Heavy, final, risky. I worried it would make people see me as unkind, selfish, or, worst of all, difficult. So, I avoided it. I said yes when I didn't mean it. I agreed to favors that drained me, stayed in conversations I wanted to leave, accepted invitations that made me quietly miserable. The price? My energy, my focus, my sense of self. Old age wisdom says, every yes is a no to something else. And I began to see it wasn't just poetic, it was painfully true. Every time I said yes to please someone else, I was saying no to my own needs. Quirky fact of the night, in Japanese. The word for no in casual conversation is often not a direct no at all. People use softer refusals, like chado, which literally means a little, but implies, I can't. There's a whole cultural dance around protecting relationships while still setting limits. I started to realize my struggle wasn't just with the word itself, it was with the guilt that came after. Saying no felt like I was taking something away from someone. But over time, I learned that what I was really doing was making space for myself, for what mattered, for the right yeses. It began small, declining a meeting that wasn't necessary, turning down a project that didn't align with my values, saying I couldn't make it to an event because I needed rest without offering an elaborate excuse. The first few times, my chest tightened as I waited for disapproval. Sometimes, I got it. People who were used to my automatic yes didn't like the change. But something interesting happened. The people who truly respected me didn't just accept my boundaries, they mirrored them back. It was in those moments I realized no isn't rejection. It's direction. It's a compass that keeps you pointed toward the life you want to live. In academic circles, there's an expression, opportunity cost. It's the value of what you give up when you make a choice. Saying yes to everything meant I was constantly paying that cost with my well-being. Now, with each no, I was reclaiming that value. And here's the thing, they say yes makes you likable, but I've found no makes you authentic. It doesn't mean I shut people out. It means the moments I do say yes are real, wholehearted, and free of resentment. The people who receive my yes now know it's because I truly mean it. Saying no turned out not to be about closing doors. It was about walking through the ones that lead somewhere I actually want to go. Part 13, Walking Away from the Familiar. I used to think familiarity was the same as safety, that as long as I stayed where things felt predictable, I could avoid disappointment, failure, or heartbreak. But Carl Jung once warned that the most damaging thing to the soul is staying in a place that no longer nourishes it. And the longer I stayed in certain situations out of habit, the more I could feel my life quietly shrinking. For me, the familiar wasn't always good, it was just known. The job I could do with my eyes closed, but which drained every ounce of creativity from me. The friendship that had turned into an unspoken competition. The daily routine that had calcified into something lifeless. I clung to these things because the unknown felt like stepping into a dark room barefoot. You don't know what you'll step on. And the human brain is wired to prefer the devil we know over the angel we don't. Old age wisdom says, ships are safest in harbor, but that's not what ships are built for. Here's a quirky fact for you. Lobsters outgrow their shells multiple times in their lives. To grow, they have to leave the security of their hard shell and be completely vulnerable until a new, bigger one forms. If they stayed in their old shell, they'd die, not from predators, but from being unable to grow. I realized I was living in an emotional shell that was 2 sizes too small. And just like the lobster, growth meant I had to risk the discomfort of exposure. Walking away wasn't dramatic, it was a series of quiet choices. I stopped showing up to conversations that revolved around gossip. I let go of work that only kept me busy instead of fulfilled. I distanced myself from people who treated my boundaries like suggestions. There's an academic term that comes to mind. Status quo bias, our tendency to stick with what we know, even when a better option is right in front of us, simply because change feels risky. Once I recognized I was under its spell, I could start challenging it. The truth, the first steps into the unfamiliar were uncomfortable. I missed the old rhythms, even the ones I didn't like. But slowly, something shifted. My days began to feel less like reruns and more like, well, premieres? And I learned something essential. The familiar will always be there, waiting for you if you want to return. But the chance to discover what else is possible, that only comes when you take the risk to walk away. Part 14, The Subtle Art of Protecting Your Peace. There was a time when I believed peace was something that happened by accident, like a sunny day or finding an old 10-pound note in your winter coat pocket. But over the years, I realized peace is not found. It's made, it's crafted, brick by brick, in the decisions we make and the boundaries we defend. Carl Jung once said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. And I think that's why protecting your peace feels so unnatural at first. It forces you to face uncomfortable truths about what and who disrupts it. I had to start by asking myself a simple, almost childlike question. Does this give me energy or take it away? That question applied to everything, conversations, commitments, even the way I spent my evenings. And you'd be surprised how many things I was tolerating simply because I thought I should. There's an old age bit of wisdom that goes, not my circus, not my monkeys. It's funny, but it's also the purest form of boundary setting. Every time I tried to fix problems that weren't mine, I was essentially handing over my mental real estate to chaos I didn't own. Here's a quirky fact. In Japan, there's a practice called Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. It's not about exercise. It's simply immersing yourself in a forest environment, letting your senses absorb the quiet. Studies show it reduces cortisol, the stress hormone, and boosts your immune system. I think boundaries work in the same way. They give you that forest-like buffer from the noise of the world. But here's the tricky part. Protecting your peace often means disappointing people. And that's where the academic term cognitive dissonance comes into play. It's that tension between wanting to be liked and wanting to live authentically. For me, The shift came when I accepted that being respected for my no was more valuable than being liked for my yes. Some people drifted away when I stopped overgiving. Others adjusted. And our relationships became healthier, and slowly, my peace became less fragile. I didn't have to fight for it every day. It became the default state because I had shaped my life to protect it. I learned that peace isn't the absence of problems, it's the presence of clarity. And clarity comes when you stop letting everyone else's storms blow through your front door. Part 15, The Lifelong Commitment to Choosing Yourself. By the time I reached this stage of my journey, I realized something both liberating and mildly annoying. It never truly ends. Choosing yourself is not a single decision you make over tea one rainy afternoon. It's a daily, sometimes hourly, commitment, like brushing your teeth. Except the plaque you're clearing away is made of other people's expectations, outdated beliefs, and your own stubborn fears. Carl Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And let me tell you, that privilege comes with a fair share of growing pains. Because every time you level up in self-awareness, life tests you with a situation that asks, "Are you sure you mean it?" It might be a job offer that looks perfect on paper, but would crush your soul in practice. Or a relationship that's comfortable but quietly erodes your self-worth. One bit of old age wisdom I often repeat to myself is, if it costs you your peace, it's too expensive. That's not just about money, it's about energy, time, and emotional bandwidth. If something drains you faster than it fills you, it's a bad bargain, no matter how shiny it looks. I sometimes think of it like gardening. A healthy life needs pruning. You don't just plant the flowers and walk away, you pull the weeds, trim the branches, and make space for the sunlight to reach the roots. And yes, occasionally you find a squirrel has stolen your strawberries. But that's just life reminding you to laugh at the absurd bits. Here's a quirky fact for you. Lobsters, those ocean-dwelling fancy appetizers, never stop growing. They just shed their shells and grow new ones, over and over. And I think humans, at least emotionally, work in much the same way. We outgrow identities, relationships, and even dreams. Choosing yourself means having the courage to shed what's too tight, even when it feels vulnerable to walk around in a new shell. From an academic angle, this ties neatly into the concept of self-actualization, that uppermost tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs where you're no longer just surviving, but thriving in alignment with your true values. It sounds lofty, but in reality, it's just about consistently acting from a place of authenticity, even when it's inconvenient. The biggest surprise for me was that choosing myself didn't make me selfish, it made me more generous. When you're not depleted, you can give freely without resentment. You can show up for people because you want to, not because you're running on guilt and obligation. And that's the kind of giving that actually lasts. Now, I see every decision, big or small, as a vote. A vote for the kind of life I want to live, the kind of person I want to be. And every yes or no I give shapes that reality. I've stopped aiming for perfect balance, because life will always tilt. Instead, I aim for honest alignment. And that, I think, is the real victory. If I could distill this entire journey into one truth, it would be this: choosing yourself is not a selfish act. It's the foundation for everything else. I began this path thinking it would be a one-time leap, a single brave choice followed by a lifetime of ease. Instead, I discovered it's a practice, an ongoing conversation between who I've been, who I am, and who I'm becoming. Along the way, I learned that growth often comes disguised as loss, that solitude isn't emptiness, but a return to yourself, that your values are your compass, and without them, you'll keep walking in circles trying to please everyone but yourself. I learned that comfort can be a cage, and the unknown, though terrifying, is where real life happens. I learned the art of saying no, not as rejection, but as redirection toward what matters. I learned that peace is something you build, protect, and sometimes fight for. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that self-choosing isn't about constant independence. It's about conscious alignment. When you know who you are and what matters to you, the relationships you keep, the work you do, and the choices you make all begin to reflect that truth. From Jung's wisdom to the small, quirky lessons of nature like lobsters shedding shells or seeds sprouting after fire, this journey taught me that transformation is messy, cyclical, and beautifully unavoidable when you commit to it. So now, every decision I make is a vote for my future self. Some days, I get it wrong, but more often than not, I find myself living a life that feels like mine, not borrowed, not inherited, not performed. And that, I think, is the quiet magic of choosing yourself. You stop living as a guest in your own life and finally come home.